Hi, this is Mark Marshall with Anatomy of Tone. In this episode, we're going to discuss using leading tones in our solos and improvisations for guitar. Leading tone is the 7th degree of the scale and it leads us back to the tonic or the root. Now, there's something specific about this 7th tone, though. It's a natural 7th. That means that we get a half step between the 7th tone and the tonic or the root note. This movement is pretty much the strongest movement you can make for a resolution. The 7th pitch being natural to the 1. It's just so conclusive. It's finalized. It sounds like it's an end of a chapter, which then sets us up to start a new chapter. In fact, the 5 chord, which is a very common resolution cadence chord, 5 back to 1, does actually have the leading tone built into the chord. Before we continue, if you're digging this channel, please hit the subscribe button. I'm going to be releasing a ton of these videos, and if you're digging this, I think you'll like a lot of the other content I'm going to be releasing. I also have a website called Anatomy of Guitar Tone. On that website, I have a lot of blogs about music theory and a lot about gear and getting sounds and using pedals and various other guitar accessories. I also have a podcast called Anatomy of Tone, which is on all podcast outlets. You can also reach out to me to get deeper into any of these theoretical or guitar concepts. I am available for private lessons, so if you just go to anatomyofguitartone.com and fill out my contact page, we could chat a bit and see if we might be a good match. Okay, back into leading tones. One interesting thing about leading tones is, let's say you have 2 chords that follow one another that are completely disconnected. Let's say C major to E flat minor. These chords have nothing in common. They don't share any common tones. One of the ways that you can help move into this E flat, if you're soloing, is that you can play a half step below. You could play a half step below the next chord's root note as a transition. It happens to be D, and there is a D in the C scale, so we could simply just go C, D, E flat. And I don't want you to think about it too much. I just want you to think about random chords and stitching them together and just using the 7th tone of the chord that we're going to as a means to leading into it. So let's take 2 more chords. Let's take C major and let's take G major. Okay, and these are related chords, the 5 chord. But if I'm going to C major and I want to transition into that C major, I could play a B note below that C. You know, if I'm going to the G chord, one thing I could do is I can play the F sharp note right before I land on the G that starts the G chord. Now there's no F sharp in the key of C. Why is that there? Because F sharp is the leading tone in the G scale. We will hear that push right into that G note, and it'll sound like a nice resolution and a nice shift into this next chord. Almost sets our ears up to feel like we're changing key centers, even if it's temporary. We have forward movement. Technically, you can use this to move into any of the chord tones that are in a chord that we're playing over. But for right now, we're going to focus on just developing this technique, moving to the roots of new chords. I've opened up Sibelius and put in the first example that we're going to look at. I just wrote down whatever chords came to mind. C, G, D, A flat, E, C. I didn't put too much thought into it only because I just wanted to demonstrate moving into the tonic or the root of each of these chords using a leading tone. Our first chord is C. In order to move into this G chord, I used F sharp, which is a half step below, which is the leading tone, the 7th degree of the G scale, to move into the G note. Our next chord is the D chord. In order to move into that, I'm going to consider what is the 7th note of the D scale, and I'm going to use that note, which is the leading tone, C sharp, into our D note. You notice it's about where we're going, not where we came from. I'm not relating that C sharp to the G chord. I'm relating that C sharp to the D chord. Same thing with the A flat chord. A flat is our tonic. I'm thinking about the 7th tone, the natural tone in the A flat major scale, and that's G natural note. Okay, we're moving to the E chord now. E natural is our tonic for E major scale. And D sharp is the 7th tone, the leading tone of the E major scale. Now we're going to go back to C. And the C major scale has no sharps and flats. The B note is the 7th, the leading tone in the C major scale. One way to think about this, if we're soloing, we can play some notes in the key of C and then grab an F sharp note at the very last second or really close to the last second to push us into G. These leading tones aren't necessarily notes that we want to spend a long time on. Doesn't mean you can't, but they're going to be most effective if you move past them and use them as just a transitionary passing note to create a push. You feel that push or it moves into G, it almost slightly feels like we've moved somewhere new. In order to use this effectively, you have to think about when you want to highlight a chord to make it feel like you're temporarily moving into that key center, or that you need to freshen things up and bring a little more attention to that specific chord, because this method is really good at bringing attention to a chord and making you feel like you've landed on it really solid. For example 3, we actually put example 3 on here, I'm going to approach it with more a scalar approach. So we're going to dance around chord scales a bit here. To D minor 7, I'm going to play the D Dorian mode until we get to the very last note, moving into that G7, which will be Mixolydian. And we're going to play an F sharp there as a leading tone. Now the F sharp doesn't exist in D Dorian, nor does it exist in G Mixolydian, but our ears hear it as a leading tone, giving a nice push into this G7 chord. More of an effect of landing on that G than it is thinking about what mode it's in. Now, a similar concept happens moving from this G7 Mixolydian into the C chord, although there is a B note that does exist in the G Mixolydian mode. It's still acting like a leading tone because it's a half step away from C or tonic. So you want to think of G as being our tonic that we're going to approach with a leading tone that's a half step below, and the same thing with C. If we're going to move back to that D minor chord, I would use a similar approach. I would approach that D minor chord using a leading tone, which would be C sharp. Now, this works best if it's just the very last note that moves into it. If we're improvising over a C chord and we're tying in C sharp and maybe not the most fluid part of the measure, then it's going to stick out and sound dissonant in an unflattering way, whereas at the end of the bar as a transition, our ears accept that dissonance as moving into the next chord. Okay, let's try to apply this on guitar. I'm just going to start very broad at first. I'm going to turn a metronome on. I believe in practicing with a metronome, and I'm using this Tama rhythm watch, and I'm going to set the tempo around 50 BPM. What I like about this is you can adjust some counter rhythms in it. So I'm going to put some eighth notes in here. So since it's a slow tempo, I could just feel a little more rhythm happening here. I'll be using this D Dorian mode, which is and then I'm going to move to this G Mixolydian mode, which is and finally land on a C note, which would be Ionian. I'm just going to improvise, but what I'm going to do is before I switch to each chord, let's do 2 bars for each chord. Okay, call out the chords now. D minor. Still on D minor. Now I'm going to transition to G. Use the leading tone now. Now I'm back in Mixolydian. Leading tone into C. I use the leading tone to get back into D minor there, right? D Dorian, I should say. Now the G. Leading tone into C. And one more time we go to D minor. It just creates this ongoing cycle that keeps happening. It just keeps getting pushed into each chord. If I'm playing that D minor, you feel it pushing into it. If I'm starting from that D minor, you feel it pushing into that G. And then it's something you could use very effectively. Let's say I'm just going to jam on some chords that are pretty far apart. Let's do C major to E flat major. 2, 3, 4. Here's C. Now here comes E flat major. I'm going to go to A major after this. D major. F major. Let's play some chords together that are pretty far removed. I'm just going to call out a random chord as I'm thinking of it in the moment. I'm just going to improvise over them, and I'm going to use a leading tone to move into whatever chord I call out. Let's start with F. 3, 4. Still on F. I'm gonna go to D now. I'm gonna go to B flat. E. You get the idea that I'm just playing whatever I want over the chord that I'm on, and then I'm using a leading tone to move into the next chord of my choice. I hope you found this helpful and a great addition to the other exercises and techniques that I've been discussing as a means to navigate through improvising or soloing over chord changes. Please leave a comment and like this video if you're digging it. See you next time.